Eyes by Ian Sputnik. Performed by Kristin Holland. My wife, Dorian, acquired a cat. Or should I say, a cat acquired my wife. With its incessant soft mewing each time she passed it, sitting on the wall of an abandoned house just a short walk from our humble abode, it pulled on her heartstrings till her resolve inevitably crumbled. She scooped it up and brought it home. A little black bundle of joy, which is all the stray seemed comprised of. From that very first day when Dorian introduced the beast to our home, the atmosphere of our little nest changed. And not for the better. It's not that the little stray did anything particularly wrong. On the contrary, a more pleasant, friendlier creature one could not wish for. And my wife doted on the tiny thing. A love that seemed entirely reciprocated by Lily, for that is what Dorian had named her. No, it wasn't her deeds. It was her eyes. From the very first instance of us being introduced to each other, I knew, in my heart and soul, that there was something very wrong with this cat. I just didn't like the way she looked at me. As the days drew on and Lily settled in, things began to spiral out of control. With each passing day, I became less the master of the house and more of an unwelcome guest. Each time I would look over to my adoring wife, I would be met by the burning gaze of those immense, glaring, evil eyes that belonged to Lily. Her scheming eyes seemed to converse directly with my psyche. "I know you know," she seemed to say, "and now you know that I know you know." That was the first occasion that my feelings manifested into physical form. It started with a stiffness around my neck and shoulders, a stiffness that turned into a thudding ache, an ache which crept its way up my spine to my head, deep into my cranium, and to the corners of my mind, into the very essence of my being. She had even invaded our marital bed. As soon as my wife turned in for the night, there she would be, cuddled up beside Dorian, ensuring that I could no longer spoon in to my wife at night. I would then have to endure a sleepless night with the low, sinister sound of Lily's rasping breath in my ear. One night I felt pressure on my chest and a warm, sickly-smelling waft of air directly into my face. I woke with a start, confronted by those big yellow eyes. They were only a matter of an inch from my face, and they were locked intently on mine. For a short moment, I could not move. I was frozen, as if a huge force was being exerted down on me. Even my arms felt pinned to the mattress. I finally broke myself out of the strange paralysis, screamed and sat bolt upright. "What on earth?" Dorian exclaimed. She had also suddenly sat upright in sheer panic. "That's it. No more," I said, shooing the cat out of the room. "That's the last time that thing sleeps with us." I then returned to bed and tried to settle back down again. My wife, obviously more than annoyed by my actions, huffed, turned over and went back to sleep, muttering words of complaint as she did so. From that night on, I would lie awake, listening to Lily pacing up and down outside our bedroom. The shadows of her paws were clearly visible between the bottom of the door and the floorboards. I would often wake in terror, sweating profusely. I imagined visions of horrific black creatures, all bearing those same glowing yellow eyes, invading my dreams and etching themselves forever into my memory. Within a matter of weeks, I had become a changed man. The outward confidence which all who knew me said I possessed seemed to have deserted me. I found it difficult to eat. Even the smallest morsel of food made me retch as soon as I deposited it into my mouth. And always, she was there, staring at me. A smug grin carefully concealed behind thick black whiskers. But I saw that evil smile, no matter how well hidden, the same way I saw what horror lurked behind those eyes, those manic, crazed, evil eyes. They say that the eyes are the windows to the soul. If this be the case, then that thing truly had the darkest soul I had ever encountered. My wife began to notice my worsening appearance, but each time she broached the subject, a soft cry for food or an affectionate rub against her leg, followed by a long purr, would drag my beloved's attention away from me and back to the cat. I would once again be relegated back to the shadows. My place in the pecking order had been confirmed. It was just above nothing, and way below the feline manipulator that had invaded our once happy home. My eviction of Lily from our bedroom had done nothing to rekindle the magic that had been lost between my wife and me. If anything, it had only pushed Dorian further away from me. Such was the feeling of revulsion and dread that Lily provoked in me, that if my wife left the house without me, I would make myself scarce. I couldn't bear to be in the room alone with that thing for fear of what she might do to me, or I to her. That was when it struck me. What could I do to her? Why should I be the oppressed? In my home, where I once ruled supreme, why should I turn my throne over to an animal? No matter what malevolent evil dwelt within Lily, in the end, she was still a cat, with only the strength of a cat, and no otherworldly power from the ether would ever change that fact. I had made my decision, and from that very moment, I began to feel inwardly stronger. I walked into the room and received a long, meaningful stare from that black abomination. I knew that she could sense a change in me. For the first time, she seemed to be on the back foot. An almost timid nervousness radiated from her stance. And so, war was declared. The next day, my wife collected her shopping bag, umbrella and gloves from the cloakroom and bade farewell to me. I knew a visit to the shops would only take her 50 minutes to an hour at most, and therefore I would have to act with all haste. The demon cat sat on the armchair by the fire. My chair, or at least it had been once. But my chair it would soon be again. A low growl emitted from Lily's throat, a long, low rasp of hatred, and I was her object of hate. As she stared at me, my head began to pound once more. I felt weak at the knees. I drew a long breath and turned to leave the living room. From that room, I passed into the kitchen, remembering to close the door firmly behind me, lest my course betray my intentions. I continued through the kitchen, unlocked the back door, and proceeded into the garden. There I made my way to the shed. The door opened with a loud creak, but I was sure that the distance between the living room and the shed would be enough that, to even the acutest hearing, it would go unheard. I was quietly confident. Yes, for the first time in weeks, confidence had returned to me. My long-lost ally had come back home. I glanced around the inside of the wooden structure until my gaze came to rest on the spade hanging from an old rusty nail on the far wall. I held it with both hands, weighing up my weapon of choice, carefully appraising its size and balance. Then I returned to the house. Holding the spade behind my back to conceal it as best I could from my adversary, I slowly entered the living room. My heart sank as the cat was nowhere to be seen. I called her name quietly, beckoning her to me as I gently moved chairs and tables around the lounge, scanning every possible hiding place where a small black agent of the devil could conceal itself. A loud hiss broke me from my quest, and I almost fell backwards as a paw swiped at my face, missing by no more than an inch. She stood on the fire's mantelpiece, her back arched, fur on end. Those wild eyes pierced into me as the sick feeling returned to my stomach, and I retched so violently that I feared I might vomit. My head pounded as if it were a maltreated drum. My sight filled with stars as it began to fail me. More in desperation than planned attack, I swung the spade with all my remaining strength. With luck rather than judgment, my weapon made contact with its intended target. The muffled thud as the spade's head struck the small, fur-covered object of my rage was sickening. I could hear the dull crack of bones as Lily fell to the floor. Her head rose once more in defiance, and she let out a howl that was not of this world, a sound I would never forget, even if I lived to be 100. Her eyes focused intently on mine as my head began to spin. Reality and illusion collided in my mind in a swirl of confusion, and I began to feel myself losing consciousness. I mustered all the strength that was left in my ebbing reserves and swung the spade repeatedly down. Again and again I beat down on the beast. With each beat of the spade, I could feel my strength returning. The pain within my head subsided, and my vision returned as I methodically staved the creature's head in. Bloody clumps of fur and flesh were sprawled across the light-stained floorboards. I didn't stop until I no longer recognised what manner of animal had met its fate at my hands. I collapsed into the armchair. My armchair. My chest rose and fell in quick succession as I gasped for air, my heart beating like an overworked machine. And I sat and breathed, each breath sweeter and more rewarding than the last. Then I looked at the fruits of my labour. The blood, the bones, the crushed and dismembered organs that lay at my feet. I allowed myself only a few moments' respite before setting to work removing all signs of our short, violent battle. After all the pieces of body had been bagged up and traces of blood were carefully cleaned from the woodwork and walls, I quickly returned to the garden. Hastily, I dug a small hole in the lawn and unceremoniously dropped the bag and bloodied cleaning cloths into the shallow grave and refilled it with earth, carefully replacing the divots of grass on top to remove any sign of my excavation. I cleaned the spade as best I could and returned it to its rusty nail, before closing the shed door and quickly returning to the living room. Just in time, as through the glass pane of the front door I could see my wife making her way up our garden path. I threw myself into my armchair and picked up a newspaper. I sat trying to look casual as I feigned interest in the first article that caught my eye. The key turned within the front door, and my shopping-laden wife entered the room with a puff of exhaustion, collapsing into the three-seater sofa opposite me. Dorian let out a sigh of relief. "Well, thank God that's over. The shops are nothing less than chaotic today. A positive free-for-all," she complained. Then came the words I was dreading. "Where's Lily?" she asked as she scanned the room. My mind went blank for an instant as I tried to calmly respond to her. "I think she's in the garden," I replied. A purely accidental pun, but one which seemed to stimulate my humour receptors all the same. I tried in vain to suppress the chuckle before it escaped my lips, but to no avail. "What's so funny?" Dorian asked. "Oh, nothing, just something that I read in the paper," I lied. "Really? So how are you feeling today? Evidently better, judging by your improved mood." I suddenly became very uncomfortable. Tiny globules of perspiration began to form on my forehead. I knew I had to leave the room immediately, lest my guilt-laden face incriminate me. "Cup of tea?" I asked as I stood and left the living room. "Oh, that would be lovely," she replied in her soft cooing voice. I entered the kitchen and closed the door behind me, slumping back onto it as I wiped the palms of my hands across my face and backwards through my hair. Did she see through my deception? Was I so transparent? She'd always told me that I was a bad liar. Then I realised. It wasn't the fear of my foul act being discovered that made me begin to sweat and panic. It wasn't the words that she spoke that got under my skin and caused my guts to retch, nor the way she said them that made my neck stiffen and my head throb. It was the way her eyes fixed on mine. I just didn't like the way she looked at me. I proceeded to the far end of the room where the kettle was standing. I passed it by without a second's thought as I opened the door and made my way back towards the garden shed.